right, I think we're just about a couple minutes past 2:30, so we'll go ahead and get started with some things while we wait for some stragglers to show up. So thank you everyone for coming today. Before we get started, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. And this was written in collaboration with our Native American Indigenous Studies program. So we're very grateful to them for getting the ball rolling on making this a common thing on campus. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the Carrizo and Kamekrudo, Cualtecan, Caddo, Tonkawa, Comanche, Lipan Apache, Alabama Cushata, Kickapoo, and Tigua Pueblo, on whose ancestral lands these galleries are located. We are also acknowledge and welcome all American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who are from or who have become a part of these lands in Central Texas. We are committed to remembering how we are connected through the land on which our space now stands, and to amplifying the voices and work of artists who remind us of these connections. We resolve to maintain open dialogue with and mutual respect toward all American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities now and into the future. There are quite a few people to thank about all the work that's gone into this exhibition and this talk today, but first and foremost, I would like to give a big shout out to Ms. Marika Alvarado, who has been a close collaborator on this project. And we're extremely grateful to her for cultivating plants and giving us her wisdom and lending us her medicines for the exhibition. And there will be an extra event that'll be happening in February. So please stay tuned for the scheduling of that, where Ms. Alvarado will be in conversation with Mr. Wilson, so you can hear more about her practice and how it's become integrated into Mr. Wilson's practice in the show that's open at the VAC. In addition to that, I'd like to thank the many, many sponsors who have helped make the exhibition possible. Obviously there are many, so I'm not going to read through all of them, but this exhibition and its programming has been a huge labor of love, and we're extremely grateful for all of these different groups across campus for stepping up and supporting the exhibition and its programming. So thank you to all of them, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with them moving forward. Now, a couple of housekeeping things just to get started. We encourage you to please interact through the chat function, and you're welcome to leave questions in the Q&A throughout the talk, and we'll get to those at the end. We're gonna set aside about 10 to 15 minutes to go over those questions. So feel free to start writing your questions in and we'll keep track of them, or you can wait until the end and then we will start to answer those for you. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen at this point. Give me 1 second. All right, so I'd like to now go ahead and welcome our esteemed speaker. For those who don't know me, first, I'm Kaila Schedeen. I'm the curator of this exhibition that we'll be kind of discussing today. But the guest of honor that we'll be speaking with today, his name is Will Wilson. And this conversation, again, is part of the exhibition called Will Wilson Air Survey that is on view at the Visual Arts Center from January 30th to March 27th. So it opens on Saturday. At that point, we encourage people to come in, and we have social distancing measures in place so you can view the exhibition safely. Through photography and installation, Santa Fe-based artist Will Wilson addresses large-scale resource extraction in the southwestern United States. From the mining of uranium, oil, and coal to the rerouting of water sources to generate hydroelectric energy power for major cities in the US, these material dislocations disproportionately harm Native American peoples and the region. Wilson addresses the catastrophic implications of these actions in Air Survey, and the exhibition provides a snapshot of his practice to date through 2 bodies of work that converge within the place known as Diné, the traditional homelands of the Diné located between New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. And Wilson himself was born in San Francisco and spent his formative years growing up in the Navajo Nation near Tuba City. He received a BA from Oberlin College in 1993 and a dissertation track MFA from the University of New Mexico in 2002, and he has been head of the photography program at Santa Fe Community College since 2014. Now there are a large list of accolades I could list about Will at this point, but I thought I'd give more of a personal introduction to this project and kind of how we came to work together. we met about 5 or 6 years ago. And since that point, Will has been extremely generous in opening up his practice and his time. And I will say, as a graduate student, that has been a very great experience to be able to work closely with an artist and to see the work that they're producing. And the work that we're going to be talking about today, a lot of it came out of a research trip that he kindly allowed me to follow him around on and be his shadow in the summer of 2019. So I look forward to him showing us more about these images and letting us into his practice. So at this point, go ahead and welcome Will on. Yeah, there you are.
How's it going?
Good. Thank you for joining us. Now, I think the way this conversation is going to work today is Will has a series of images that he'll walk us through, and we'll do a little bit of back and forth. But I know you might want to do your own introduction, Will, so I'll let you go ahead and get started, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kayla. It's an honor to be, talking about this amazing undertaking that we've been working on for a few years now. And I just wanted to say thank you to you, Kayla, for being an amazing curator and collaborator, and just putting it all together and really making it happen.
Thank you, Will.
You're welcome. I also want to thank Mackenzie Stevens, who's the director of the Visual Arts Center there at UT, for also kind of working behind the scenes to make all this happen. And Mark Silva, who's kind of on one of the hats he wears, I think, is a preparator there, and he's just like this amazing engineer and problem solver, and really helped bring our vision of what this could be, the air survey, together in this amazing space. And also Mark's crew, who were amazing. And then Marika Alvarado, who's kind of the collaborator in terms of the indigenous food species component, the Air Lab. And I got to meet Marika recently, and we exchanged pollen, and I'm really excited to see how that aspect of the exhibition unfolds soon. So yeah, I think maybe I will just jump in at this point and show you some images, talk a little bit about my background. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right, so here's the first image in the slideshow. And I love to show this image just because it, I think, kind of situates us kind of temporally, and also, I don't know, it makes me think about how much change has occurred in such a short amount of time. So this image here is an image of my my family. The two women in the foreground are my Aunt May and my mother, Lola Etsidi, the young girl. And I imagine she's about 10 years old in this image. Their older sister, Sally, is in the wagon. And this was, their trip to the Tuba City Trading Post. So they were going from, I think, I would imagine it was summer sheep camp on their way to Tuba. And this is how they got around, I also imagine that this maybe was taken in mid to late 50s. And in relation to a lot of the mining that was going on in the Navajo Nation, it was well underway at this point, but it was also kind of a heyday, I think, in that period. So, photography has been a kind of essential form of communication and self-expression for me. Early on, I did a lot of analog photography. I definitely, I think, was drawn to a kind of documentary voice, photographing a lot of the daily goings on of my friends and family. This is my grandmother, Martha City, who's on, I guess, my left in the photograph, and her good buddy. And I should also say that kind of installation and sculpture and thinking about space architecturally has also been kind of a kind of driving driving theme in my work. This is an image from Oberlin College, and it was kind of my, thesis show, or the final big show I did there as a student.
Well,
Uh,
I was wondering if I could ask a question, just because this is something
sure.
I've run across in your practice and seen the kind of evolution of your use of collage.
Mm,
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think it's something you continue to do, and we'll see in the works that are in this exhibition at the VAC. But you see kind of a hint of that starting to happen in this image. So could you just talk about how you came to that as sort of a format that you lean towards using in your practice?
yeah, I mean, I think I've always thought about photography as kind of a abstraction of the way that real kind of experience operates in the world, and I think pretty early on I was always made to think about how photography's relation to kind of the truth was something that is constructed, and I think by kind of building either installation or maybe also creating collage, I'm constantly thinking about that on some meta, like material level almost, right? And so it's always part of, I think, the way that I approach photographs, just kind of acknowledging that they're discursive and they build on one another, and kind of meaning is something that accrues after you've kind of processed a number of these images, and then that story can be kind of shifted in different directions, so I don't know, I think that's always been something central. Something else about the installation and thinking about kind of space, I've always been kind of I guess challenged by the way that photography just operates as this object to be kind of consumed, right? And so for me, creating space that would surround the viewer, that would kind of envelop a person looking at the work, was a means of kind of challenging that idea, right? So you become kind of part of this space, and you're surrounded by photography, and your reception of it is altered um, through that process. Um, this is my MFA show. I went to the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and I really love that photography program and that kind of opportunity to spend a few years just focused on making art, and having conversations about art. I think being a graduate student was an amazing um, kind of opportunity and a privilege. Um, but so this is kind of the culmination of a few years of work. Still, everything's kind of analog at this point, but again, space is important, and structure. Um, And then this is a little later, but it kind of foregrounds and is part of the current exhibition. So AIR in AIR survey stands for autoimmune response. And the title of that work, I think, is, revealing, and is a good starting point to think about what this all means, and, what I've been engaged in for a number of years now. But so I was thinking about, the environment and how kind of suddenly the environment has been transformed for Indigenous peoples, right? Including my family. And, you know, um, because of that kind of sudden change or shift, a number of autoimmune diseases have kind of plagued um, us. And so kind of thinking about that, and then also thinking about using that as kind of a lens to figure out how to respond to this situation. So how to kind of call it out, and then also maybe potentially come up with some solutions to the situation, has been kind of at the at the foundation of this project, right? So this is the first one. Um, and autoimmune response, I played this character, the protagonist, who's this post-apocalyptic Navajo man who's trying to figure out what's going on with the world, and how to kind of exist in it and survive. On the far left side of this image, there's a kind of early photoshopped version of a Nevada test cloud, like sort of an atomic test cloud going on. Um, And so that's always been kind of like in the back of my mind, the kind of history of extraction and particularly energy resource extraction, fissile material, uranium. Um, this is the protagonist, kind of featured in a number of different situations at the confluence of the Little Colorado and Colorado rivers. Um, Also, kind of near my family's winter sheep camp. And so, in these first kind of set of images, this series that's ongoing, the protagonist finds shelter. He finds a hogan, a traditional Navajo like architectural form. It becomes a laboratory, um, and he sets out from this site to figure out how to live in this world. Um, Something else that I think that I was thinking about when I was putting these images together was kind of Diné or Navajo mythology. And in the creation story, there are twins, these hero twins born of water and monster slayer that are able to go out into the world and rid the world of monsters, right? To make this world, the fourth world, habitable for humans, for us. Um, and so by the end of this cycle of images, our protagonist kind of builds his own house or his own hogan, right? And so,
Hey, Will, I'm wondering if you could go back. Well, we're seeing some of the images now. I was just noticing as you're kind of setting this up, the importance of water and the landscapes that you're photographing. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that and like the specific place that you're photographing in, and the season and how this landscape came to look this way, and then what water means for your practice kind of as a whole.
that's a really good question. I mean, in the arid Southwest, you know, on the Navajo Nation in Diné, water is incredibly important. Water is life. And, it's an absolute necessity. These images in particular were taken during the summer months. At the end of the summer, the monsoons come through and, they bring this nourishing rain. And, you know, um, we're incredibly dependent on these cycles. Um, but I've also, I think, thought a lot about contamination and the threat to that incredibly important resource, and that figures um, in images to come that highlight some of these abandoned uranium mines that's kind of at the intersection of this project with this connecting the dots project that we'll talk about soon. um, so this was the first iteration of the autoimmune response project. It was at the Herd Museum in Phoenix. That traveled to a number of different institutions. But at some point, I was thinking, what's the next phase or what's the next step? Um, and so the autoimmune response Hogan or Air Lab is what I'm calling it now, I think, becomes a greenhouse for the cultivation of indigenous food species, right? Because you have to have shelter and then you have to have food. Um, and so I've had the opportunity to kind of install this at different venues, and now there at UT Austin, in collaboration with Marika Alvarado, um, we're going to bring plants into the space and site. So I'm really excited about that. This particular image was shot at the Denver Botanical Gardens, and they actually propagated a number of the food species that the protagonist is thinking about bringing back into the world and terraforming with. And so I got to use these amazing kind of industrial scale greenhouses as a backdrop for kind of the furthering of this idea. Um, this is an early example of something that we're calling a digitype these days, and it's kind of bringing together a couple different photographic processes, right? This historic wet plate collodion tintype technology, a 19th century photographic process that was used really to describe what's now the American West in the mid to late 19th century, when the U.S. kind of was able to acquire this land. Um, and then also digital photography, right? So um, the wet plate doesn't have color except for this interesting kind of sepia tone that happens sometimes. But with the advent of digital and Photoshop, I'm able to kind of shoot um, two images, both the analog and the digital, and kind of blend them together.
Could you talk like more about the labor that goes into actually doing a tintype? Because I think a lot of people don't quite understand like how difficult it is to create just one of these tintypes.
Yeah, so tintype or wet plate is called wet plate because you have to have a darkroom. Essentially, you're making your own large format film, um, and you have a darkroom that you bring with you and you carry with you wherever you go to make these images. You set that up. You first kind of create an emulsion by combining a few different chemicals, but one of them is collodion, uh, and then silver nitrate, right? And so you've made your film, and then you go and you photograph it. It's not very sensitive to light. It's about an ISO 1, um, you know, which is a lot less sensitive to light than what we're used to today. It's also not panchromatic, so it can't see all of the wavelengths that current film or sensors can see. Um, and so that's one of the reasons why I blend it with the digital, because it can't see, well, it's particularly sensitive to blues, actually. So any kind of um, image that has blue as a skyline or a background will just go completely white, because it's you know overexposed. Anyway, um, the film can't dry out. That's why they call it wet plate. So you have to get back into the dark room, process it right away, um, and you get an image. I mean, it is very gratifying because you get to see what you're doing right away. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a labor intensive process, and sometimes it can be finicky and difficult, and you find that out when you're out in the landscape and you don't have a dark room nearby or other recourse. But we try and make it work. So this autoimmune response kind of project has been ongoing, and I imagine I will kind of continue to do this as long as I can. um, so the current show at UT Visual Arts Center is kind of an intersection of a couple different projects. So it's the autoimmune response project, which um, has been ongoing since 2004, and then a much more current project, which I'm tentatively calling Connecting the Dots, that looks at the kind of history of uranium mining and kind of fissile material extraction on the Navajo Nation. This image in particular is the United Nuclear Corporation's Church Rock uranium mill spill, which is actually the US's worst nuclear accident um, by the numbers, and nobody really knows about it, right? And so this occurred in July of 1979. And this is not my photograph, but it's an aerial photograph of the spill site. But let's see, I can just tell you a little bit about this. So over 100,000, oh no, over 1,000 tons of solid radioactive mill waste and 93 million gallons of acidic radioactive tailings flowed into the Porco River, and contaminants traveled 80 miles downstream to Navajo County, Arizona, and onto the Navajo Nation. 17 miles away, the community of Gallup was particularly affected because the Puerco River flows right through Gallup. Anyway, it's an example of, a, a terrible nuclear disaster that nobody kind of knows about and is aware of. And it's kind of an inspiration for this Connecting the Dots project. This is actually not my image. This is an image by the photographer Joel Sternfeld, and it's entitled Rare Metals, which is the name, the euphemistic name that the corporation gave to this uranium processing mill, which is about 4 miles from Tuba City, Arizona. And you can see the kind of remnants of the mill itself. And then behind there, there's all of this yellow kind of cake. And this is, you know, the process, the yellow cake, the tailings piles, the contamination. When I was younger, I used to go here with my cousins and kind of play in this thing because it was like the one cool kind of post-industrial thing on the landscape that we could, you know, go be adolescents at. Now it looks like this. It's a super fun site, and remediation is underway. And you know, you'll see a number of these images of these different sites that are actively kind of worked on, you know, in remediation. But the Connecting the Dots project is referring to 521 abandoned uranium mines that are kind of identified on the Navajo Nation. So in this image, you can see where Rare Metals is in the top top right hand corner, and it's pretty close to Tuba City. And then back to your point, Kaila, about water and kind of water, the importance of water as a resource. One of the issues with this site is just below it is the Moenkopi Wash, which flows through the community of Moenkopi, the Hopi community there, and then also just below Tuba City, Arizona, the Navajo community where I grew up. And the Moenkopi Wash is an important kind of site of agriculture, right? And so people kind of grow corn and crops there. And there's a fear that there might be groundwater contamination from the mill site that eventually will make its way to the wash, and potentially contaminate, you know, this important kind of food source.
Could you go back to that rare metals image for a second? What it looks like now. I'm wondering if you can walk people through what we're actually seeing here and what a Superfund site is, because I realized in talking about this project with people that not a lot of people actually understand what a Superfund site is, and how it comes up, the site comes to be designated as that and what that exactly means. And then what has actually happened here in the quote unquote remediation process.
So, you know, this is the site in the early 80s. And then this is what it looks like after it's been remediated. So I think a Superfund site, I'm not sure about the specific kind of legislative criteria, but basically it's, you know, some of the worst kind of sites of contamination. And there is a Environmental Protection Agency kind of fund set up, the Superfund site, to do remediation for these kind of worst of the worst locations and sites. And so the remediation that's going on here at Rare Metals involves kind of burying everything that was there and capping it with you know, some kind of membrane material, and then also a clay body, and then on top this black stone stuff. And you know, I think the idea behind that is that, you know, the contamination is not just going to go blowing in the wind in every direction. And then also there's this pool, this pond next to it, and when they do this, they put plumbing underneath the site so that the idea is that when it rains and there is kind of the potential for groundwater contamination, that water is then pumped up, and there are these evaporation ponds where, you know, the contaminant hopefully is captured and then, you know, contained at that point. And yeah, I mean, in this image too, if you look up on the kind of horizon line, you can also see the Moenkopi Wash is not very far from this site, unfortunately. One other thing to note just about this image and about the installation at the VAC is that we've kind of devised this space that's, you know, that's one of these air labs or these autoimmune response kind of hogans. And at the center of it is corn pollen, right? Which is in Navajo, it's Schedeen, and it's this sacred substance that, you know, we used to pray with. And instead of having kind of uranium at the core of this kind of explosive lens form, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, we've put corn pollen there. And that corn pollen is actually from the fields kind of just below this site. So there's this kind of crazy cyclic thing going on in terms of that as well. So pretty close to Tuba City, Arizona. This is the Navajo Nation's abandoned uranium mines map that was put together kind of as a collaboration between the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Navajo Nation Environmental Protection Agency. And if you look over on the left side, you can see Tuba City and a number of red dots. So there's this kind of corridor in the Western Navajo Agency, which is kind of, you know, where I grew up and my part of the res. And, you know, it's literally littered with red dots there. And so, you know, over the course of, you know, the next few months, I'm going to be doing this kind of survey of this region, at least a photographic survey. This is from that area. This is actually just south of the reservation line, the Navajo Nation line, at a place called Babbitt Ranch, where there was an upgrader facility. And you can see that kind of over to the left. But you can also see the Little Colorado River, which is an important water source in the region. It wasn't running when I was there, but you know, all of these depressions in the landscape that are contaminated do fill with water during the rainy season. And, you know, there's still a lot of families who herd sheep and they have cattle, and livestock is drawn to water on the land, you know, and there isn't any kind of regulation of that kind of, you know, potential contamination. Another image, this is the evaporation ponds from the Church Rock spill site. And this is the autoimmune response protagonist at the site of the Mexican hat disposal cell, which is at Halchita, Utah on the Navajo Nation. And it's really kind of the place that I kicked off this Connecting the Dots project. And then this is where Kaila accompanied me to kind of begin this survey project. And this is, again, this idea of kind of bringing together you know, ideas about the history of photography and survey in the American West with, you know, the current project of surveying these sites of contamination and remediation on the nation. So another view of this kind of extended panorama is here. So this is shot with the drone, probably, I don't know, 1,000 feet in the air. Something that's kind of, I think, an essential component of this Connecting the Dots project is now the ability that's been kind of unlocked to image kind of environmental injustice, environmental racism, particularly out here in the West, by this new aerial capability, right? So the drones have kind of unlocked this potential. Because you know, it's hard to understand the immensity from this view. Um, but when you're able to see the world from 1,000 feet up, it kind of transforms your capacity to understand what's going on.
Could you point out like specifically what we're seeing in the background of this image too? Because I think that's one of the most interesting parts of this one.
Yeah, so not only is this, you know, an image of kind of contamination and kind of environmental devastation, but it's on the horizon is, you know, the famous Western landscape of Monument Valley from, you know, I don't know, John Ford's Searchers to Forrest Gump. This road actually leads to what's called Forrest Gump Hill, you know, where there's this really kind of majestic vista that a lot of people drive up to just to kind of see the valley. But when The Searchers was kind of being filmed in 1956, the mill that was at this site um, was just being developed, right? So the same year that The Searchers was filmed, the Mexican Hat um, uranium mill was being sited or developed here. And there's a number of different mines in the Monument Valley region that were particularly kind of productive. Um, and, you know, so there's a legacy of Navajo families who've lived in this region for, you know, generations that are not only have been affected, but will be affected by the contamination on the land. Um, so
I actually had pulled a quote. This might be a good time to read it just to give people a sense of the immensity of the legacy of uranium mining on the Navajo Nation, which really began in World War II when the US was attempting to build the first atomic bomb, which they successfully did, and that turned into the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The One of the primary materials for making atomic weaponry is uranium. And during the 1940s, the US government discovered that there were stores of uranium in the Colorado Plateau region, which is mostly ancestral Navajo lands. And so they basically moved in, and using Navajo workers, miners, they kind of ravaged this landscape and brought up tons and tons, millions of tons of uranium, not warning workers in the process that there were growing links between uranium mining as work and radioactive illnesses later in life. So just to give you a sense of what that meant and what that continues to mean, there's a book called Wastelanding. It's by Tracy Bryn Voiles. And I think she kind of pulls together some statistics that really hit this point home in a really depressing way. But she wrote, by the mid 1980s, researchers found astronomical rates of cancer deaths among former uranium miners. Miners contracted lung cancer at rates 56 times higher than the national average and had an average life expectancy of only 46 years. Rates for stomach cancer were 82 times the national average. Miners were more than 200 times more likely to get liver cancer, almost 50 times more likely to get prostate cancer, and over 60% more likely to have cancers of the bladder or pancreas. And she goes on and on with a number of statistics and discusses the fact that there's a fatal neurological disease that has been named Navajo neuropathy in children, specifically because it emerged in this area of the country. So this is an extremely disastrous history that I think people are continuing to deal with. And this is essentially the photo we're seeing is sort of the fallout of this site that's been remediated. But as Will is going to point out, you can still see obviously the scars on the landscape of this sort of history.
yeah, I mean, you know, it's really a disturbing and tragic story. I think a lot of people know you know, the history of the Navajo code talkers and how language was this powerful kind of vehicle with coding and you know how it essentially helped win the war. But a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the fissile material was sourced from the Navajo Nation. And you know, I think part of the selling point of this was to kind of help defend the homeland, and it was this kind of call to patriotism for these people. And you know, the crazy thing is that folks were well aware of the dangers of this, and they did not provide the miners or their families with these warnings, with the information that would have, you know, kind of enabled them to protect themselves on some level. But also, you know, I mean, where was OSHA? Where was the, you know, the kind of environmental protection that that would have, you know, kind of protected some of the folks who were engaged in this work from getting sick? Um, Certainly members of my family. I don't think any family on the nation, you know, escaped the impact of this on some level. Um, you know, the Navajo neuropathy thing. I remember growing up with a kid and kind of sort of being his caretaker on some level at Tuba City boarding school, who you know had this. One of the kind of telling aspects of it is, you know, your hands kind of, I don't know. My father had rheumatoid arthritis, but you know, this kid, his fingers were kind of clenched like this, and I don't, it, you know, very debilitating, very kind of sad um, thing to live with, and I think to live through. And the legacy is, you know, it's ongoing. It's like, what's the half life of uranium? You know, this poison is it's silent. It's, you can't see it. It happens over the course of a really long time. But it's going to be there with us, you know, for thousands of years. Um, so this is another image from that same site, um, and I think when we were there, when Kaila and I were there, I noticed that there was something out in the kind of, you know, looking at my viewfinder from the drone. I was like, what is this little white dot like out in the middle of this field of this sea of river rocks? And so I sent the drone out. Oh, shoot. I was just going to talk about an image that I don't have in the slideshow.
You can keep talking. I'll try and pull it up, see if I have it.
Okay. So anyway, there's this tiny little dot here, and there's actually a monument to this site that talks a little bit about it, but we'll come back to that. But you know, I mean, there are a number of these locations throughout the reservation where this kind of major Superfund remediation has occurred. This is in Shiprock, New Mexico, and it's right on the banks of right on the banks of, oh God, the name of this, the river escapes me right now. Kaila, do you remember?
I do not remember.
It's the San Juan River.
I can offer the image, however. I found the image.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let me end my slideshow for a second. Or no, I won't end my slideshow. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, can you see it here?
There we go. Yeah. And you can see the kind of shadow of the drone there. And so, you know, imagine this kind of like top-down view that gets you closer and closer in scale, but eventually you come to this strange plaque in the middle of this kind of toxic field. And it says Mexican Hat, Utah, date of closure, July 20th, 1994, dry tons of tailing, 4,400,000. And then I think gives an estimate on the amount of radioactivity there, which is 1,800 curies of Ra-226. Anyway, it's an odd thing to memorialize through a monument.
Yeah, I've always imagined it as like if we all were to you know, perish because of this history, then beings from other planets would come and that would be the only thing that they would find.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm going to try and share my screen again.
And just FYI, well, I think we have about 5 more minutes before we need to move to questions.
Okay, sure. So share that, and I'll be quicker about this. Okay. So the shiprock disposal cell in the Navajo Nation, um, the beginnings of this survey, the Connecting the Dots survey. This is near Cameron, Arizona, in the Navajo Nation. It's again a section of that map that I showed in the western region, where between Page, Arizona, in the north, and Flagstaff, there's over 100 abandoned uranium mines on that site. So there's a lot to photograph. This again is kind of talking back to that intersection of projects, right? And so this is the protagonist who's kind of reappeared and will, be visiting the project, calibrating a drone, right? And so one of the kind of limitations of the project with these smaller commercial drones is that you can't get a super high resolution camera up there, but so I've kind of upped the ante in terms of what I can fly and the kind of payload capacities. And so hopefully I'll be able to get more higher res images. And just because I don't know, there's something about scale. I really like to make these images large, and so that you're kind of enveloped in them. But these are some of the installation shots from the exhibition, air survey at the Visual Arts Center there in UT. So there's this central Hogan form, which is the air lab, and it's got this core in the center of it with the corn pollen, and then there's the tower, the air tower, that is kind of reminiscent of the tower that they used for the first nuclear device, right, at the Trinity site. And there's also a video component, and so you can see some of the drone footage flying over Mexican Hat and through Mexican Hat. And this is kind of at the core. So I've become kind of enamored with the geodesic form, and the geodesic, or the roof for this Hogan is a geodesic dome, and it actually is a icosahedron, which is the same geometric form as the explosive lens of the first nuclear bomb, the gadget. And the idea is that, with this soccer ball configuration and explosions, all of this force from around the sphere would be focused towards the center. And at that center was the plutonium core. And we've replaced the plutonium with this kind of sacred life-giving substance, the corn pollen, in this kind of iteration of it. So yeah.
That's perfect timing. And this is also the structure where Marika Alvarado's plants are going to be going into. So it will look a little bit different once the exhibition actually opens on Saturday. And we're looking forward to seeing how that all comes together. I think it's going to be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
So I think we have time for questions. I have one question, so I'll go ahead and read it. Does the technology you're using to capture images determine the scale of the work?
To some extent, for sure. I mean, I've been using the DJI Mavic 2 Pro and the Mavic Air 2 drones, and there's a limitation in terms of how big you can blow those up before the images like start to fall apart, right? And so now with that bigger drone, I've got a Sony A7R Mach 4 or whatever, so about a 50 megapixel camera now on the drone. So yeah, and I don't know, I can print them about this big, like maybe 2 by 3 at max with the smaller drones, but with the larger one, you can definitely make a larger image, which is something that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I think the larger drone really was capped at size just because of the paper we were using to print it on, which is called Phototex, and it only comes in a certain size roll, and so there's only specific height you can reach before you have to start layering the images on top of each other, which it's interesting to see that in the space.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think we were responding to as we were designing the exhibition was how kind of how voluminous that space is. It's like pretty intimidating to walk in there when there isn't much going on, and wanting to fill it just required large images. So, but I think we did a decent job of kind of pulling it all together. Um,
I think we did a great job. I think you did a great job, Will.
we all did.
We all did. Okay, we
Definitely.
have a couple of questions coming in, so I'll go ahead and pose them. Mackenzie asks, you mentioned that this project is ongoing. Can you talk a bit about what you will do next and what the next steps or next components will be?
Yeah, I mean, in the near future, I think I really want to just get back out there. I mean, that's been a little tough with the pandemic, and there have been, kind of these 96-hour curfews on the Navajo Nation, where they've asked everybody to really try and limit any kind of travel outside of the home. And then I certainly don't want to bring anything on to the reservation from my base in Santa Fe. I've been getting tested a lot. My nose has been suffering for it, but yeah, I really want to kind of focus on the Western Navajo Agency kind of abandoned uranium mine area, and just start cataloging as many of these as possible. I think having that as a motivation to kind of be out on the land, and then start to kind of identify, important stakeholders, people who are organizing around this, community members who live near these sites, and just start talking and interviewing. I've got another kind of dream project where I do a lot of kind of interview and use the wet plate process to make portraits of people kind of on these different sites, and actually kind of combine that old technology with a newer augmented reality kind of technology, so that using my app, which is called Talking Tintypes, you scan an image, and the person kind of comes to life, and kind of giving agency, I guess, back to a still image and a subject, and having them talk about their experience with this. So yeah, the survey will continue hopefully shortly.
Next question. Thank you both so much for this conversation. Will, have you thought about your drone photographs at all in terms of Alan Sekula's term, counter-forensics? Sekula uses this term to think about how forensic methods have also become tools of opposition.
Yeah, well, I love that idea. I mean, I guess I think of drone photography kind of having its uh, its roots in surveillance technology, and potentially, I've heard a lot about kind of like state surveillance, and how drones can like work for police departments, and kind of surveilling a populace without anybody knowing about it. But I guess taking that technology and using it kind of in a counterintuitive way to kind of reveal um, environmental injustice, for sure. I think there's been a lot of talk about how kind of subverting maybe the original intentions of this technology for for revealing injustice. So certainly, I mean, I think it's an incredible tool, and it's empowering. It's very expensive to rent a helicopter, or to fly a plane, to get this kind of view that I think really has an impact. I think people can really understand the kind of where these things are sited, how close people actually live to them, the potential kind of vectors of contamination. Um, I have some kind of interesting software, this photo scan. Well, now it's called Metashape, but essentially you can kind of take multiple pictures from the air and throw it at this software and create kind of 3D modeling. And I would love to start kind of incorporating that as part of the survey practice, the Connecting the Dots project. So, you know, I kind of becoming a citizen scientist in some ways, I think.
I love that term,
Yeah.
citizen scientist. Okay, so thank you so much for looking to your artistic process and work, Will. My question is about what the term landscape means for you. The word term has been adopted numerous definitions over the years, sometimes with an emphasis on social, political, and quote unquote natural aspects. I'd be curious to hear how you define or understand it within your practice.
Hmm. That's a great question. I mean, I think on one level, I'm hoping to point to it with these kind of digitite things that I'm creating with the wet play. So think about the history of landscape from one perspective, right? From a perspective of kind of a colonizing kind of state interest, like this land as this open, empty space to be exploited, right? I think that was, one of the main motivations behind some of that early survey photography, and using, the technology of those times to kind of bring those ideas to the fore and merge them with kind of this history of contamination that happened on the reservation. Um, so I think about it a lot in terms of the history of photography. Um, I think land, as a resource, as something that we are of, and kind of thinking about incorporating that understanding, is something that is I hope embedded in my autoimmune response project to some extent, like thinking about these customary architectural forms that are made of the earth, and that there's this kind of, I think, whole world view that comes from Diné people about their link directly to the land as this life-giving force, as this kind of sentient being or entity that we are, connected to. I mean, that's just logical, right? I think it's only recently that we've kind of separated uh, ourselves from the land in a really odd way.
Mhm.
But I hope, yeah, that continues to be something that I investigate through this project.
Great. So this person says, my first impression is that Will's work engages in a kind of Diné futurism, the hybridizing of photographic technologies, the geodesic dome, or sorry, geodesic hogan, the resonances between terraforming, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic speculations. In short, to make this a question, I'm wondering if Will thinks that such a term gets at what he's trying to do, imagining the Navajo Nation in a future where it has long been excluded from.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that term is interesting, and indigenous futurisms. Um, I mean, I always think about that term and think about kind of more of like a cyclic understanding of time that might be situated kind of outside of you know the West. And I know that, like, my grandparents thought of time in a very different way than at least my Navajo grandparents, because they also have Irish and Welsh grandparents. But thought of time in a very different way. So this notion of futurism, um, a long time ago, I heard a student from the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I don't know who this was because they're coming to me kind of, they were witnessing my graduate review, but they were talking about remembering the future, and that idea has always kind of stuck with me. That this may seem futuristic to you, but it's actually something that we've already lived through. And so maybe these are cautionary tales, from an indigenous perspective. Like, you might not want to head down this path because we know where it's leading. We've already kind of lived it and survived it. I know a number of kind of contemporary indigenous artists are kind of thinking in those terms as well. But Yeah, I mean, the term indigenous futurism is very sexy, and I think it's something that, like, you know, it's a head turning thing. You're like, okay, I'm going to pay attention to that for a little bit. So yeah, I think so. I'll take that term. I'll own it.
Um, yeah, no, it's interesting. I think Indigenous futurism has really taken on a life of its own in the arts right now, and thinking about whether that could be adapted to a Diné futurism in particular, I think is interesting. So I think it's a great question. Um, one more question. As person says, I'm particularly interested in the protagonist. Would you be willing to speak more about how this alternate character came about and what it feels like to inhabit him? Do you feel your own perspective shift from within the character?
Hmm, that's a yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's something that's very super personal about that, about me inhabiting that character. And I think on one level, it gives me agency and it makes me feel really powerful. And on another level, it's, I think, like a place where, you know, I don't know, by helping to tell this tale, like somehow I'm healing myself on a really kind of personal level. So for sure, the protagonist is an empowering, I think, and kind of almost like sacred or like therapeutic kind of role for me to play, and kind of like work through not only, you know, a more historical kind of like intellectual trauma, but also just, you know, kind of what how that trauma has been embodied in me as a person. So kind of activating that role is important to me, and I think that's why, you know, it's important for me to have that protagonist figure like show up in this more, you know, survey or contemporary work that I'm doing. But you know, I love that those two things can intersect and live side by side, at least for moments. Um, but yeah, that's a good question.
All right. Well, I think that's actually probably a perfect place to end. Unless you'd like to add anything else, I think that's all of the questions have been answered. So thank you
I would
so
just
much,
say,
Will.
yeah, thank you too. I mean, this has been a an amazing opportunity and platform that you've helped to facilitate.
Oh,
So
thank
thank
you. Well,
you.
I'm incredibly grateful. I think this has been such, it was a prescient sort of topic before the pandemic happened when we had started discussing the exhibition, and now it's even more so. So I'm really excited for people to interact with it in whatever way they feel comfortable. There will be some online elements of the exhibition. You can access um, the exhibition catalog and some images once those are taken. So even if you don't feel comfortable physically coming in to the space, we encourage you to go online to the website and interact with the exhibition that way. So I think that probably is it for us. So thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks so much.